Lovely. Anyway, let me introduce to you the original Brotherhood of 1848 to 1853 and what is often referred to as the Second Brotherhood or the Oxford Summer of 1857. On the far left, we have the familiar face of John Everett Millais, one of the original Pre-Raphaelite brothers, and you might recognise William Morris, courtesy of George Frederick Watts on the far right. But the figure in the centre probably is not as well known to anybody. He is Thomas Combe, who was the manager, I probably should say director, of the Oxford Clarendon Press. And I would argue that if it probably wasn't for him, we wouldn't be having this discussion about the Pre-Raphaelites and their impact on British art, because it was patrons like Thomas Combe who came to their rescue right at the beginning of their career when they were very much being ridiculed in the public press. So we are going to have one of my whistle-stop tours through various connections between Oxford and the Pre-Raphaelites, but I want to start with just the basics, just to remind you, and some people may not be as familiar with the Pre-Raphaelites as others. Just wanted to remind you of why they're called the Pre-Raphaelites. Some people are very confused by that nomenclature. It simply means that you like the art of the Quattrocento, the 1400s, before Raphael. It was essentially painting between about 1505 and 1520. So the Pre-Raphaelites favoured the Florentine and Sienese artists of the 1400s. So I'm showing you, as an example, Friar Angelico's famous altarpiece of the Annunciation. They appreciated the bright colours. That comes, of course, from tempera painting, tempera on panel, where the pigments are bound with egg rather than oil. They are also attracted to fresco, and sometimes their paintings will have the sort of luminosity that we associate with fresco painting. They like the format, the old-fashioned, if I can put it that way, triptych, or here the predella panels telling the story down the bottom. And also the fact that this particular panel, telling the story of the Annunciation, has got two narrative elements within it: the casting out of Adam and Eve, and then the coming of the new Eve in the form of the Virgin Mary. So they like that idea of narrative, telling a story, often in sequence. So that's the basic reason why they are called Pre-Raphaelites. They simply admire the art before Raphael. But at the time, that was seemed to be rather heretical, because essentially the National Gallery told a story that led up to Raphael as the high point of Western European art. It was on a decline ever after. And so these Quattrocento artists are often referred to as primitives, to imply that they have not yet reached the sophistication of the arts of Raphael, which was held up to be a paragon of virtue. Here's another example of the art, or the painters, that the Pre-Raphaelites favoured. This is Jan van Eyck's Betrothal of the Arnolfini, a particularly famous painting in the National Gallery that we know was one of William Morris's favourites. Again, they were attracted to the luminous colours, the incredible attention to detail, all these symbolic objects like the dog, the outdoor shoes that have been cast off on the left-hand side, and the oranges on the window that allude to the forthcoming marriage. They were particularly attracted to the mirror, which has the Stations of the Cross running around the outside. If you look carefully into the mirror, you can see the artist coming in, who is in effect a witness to the betrothal. This idea of using things to tell the story, the narrative, was referred to by Holman Hunt as symbolic realism. Again, people are rather mystified by the way in which the Pre-Raphaelites used the word realism. But remember that the Academy had been encouraging ideal high art, and the Pre-Raphaelites like this idea of going back to Pre-Raphaelite paintings where the people depicted within appear to be real as opposed to idealized, and the objects are very faithfully rendered. One of the interesting aspects of Pre-Raphaelitism is that the ideas floating around, which will come to fruition with the founding of the Brotherhood in 1848, were already very much in the ether and can be best exemplified by the Nazarenes. This was a group of artists who settled in Rome. They had this unusual name, Nazarenes, because they looked rather, to be honest, Christ-like, wearing long flowing robes, growing their hair long. And they, again, were on a mission to overturn academic idealism. This is Johann Friedrich Overbeck. He's one of the principal members of the Nazarenes, who some of them essentially, they're German, but they sort of moved from Munich to Rome, and they want to unify North and South. So in my painting here, Italia, it looks rather like she should be in a Titian or a Giorgione painting, and Germania is the one with the sort of Brunhilde long curls. And they want to bring the arts of the North and the South together. And they too are interested in Quattrocento painting, though I think you'll agree that in terms of their figure types, they seem to look more like Raphael than even some of Raphael's paintings. So they have a beautiful sweetness to them in terms of the figure types. The other important thing about the Nazarenes is that they want to revive tempera painting. This is this idea again of going back to pigment bound in egg rather than oil to get the luminosity of Quattrocento painting. And they're also interested in fresco. So they're going to bring back the whole idea of public painting. Prince Albert was particularly attracted to the Nazarenes. Remember, he shares a similar birthright, German. And there is even a suggestion that Peter von Cornelius should play a decisive part in decorating the new Palace of Westminster, which was being rebuilt after the Great Fire that had destroyed it in 1834. It was not likely that a German was going to be put in charge of a cycle depicting British art, but the important thing was that the Nazarenes were very much focused on this idea of public art and using frescoes and murals. Given that they convert to Roman Catholicism, they are also very keen on painting religious subjects. And again, this was something that at the time to be seen as problematic. We are a Protestant country, and many of us objected to what was seen to be a form of idolatry, painting religious scenes. So this is going to be important when we come to understand what is going on in Oxford. So here is Joseph von Fröhlich, one of, again, the followers of the Nazarenes, the meeting of Jacob and Rachel. And here is the British painter, William Dyce, who is being influenced by these ideas coming from Europe. Again, Dyce was a great favourite of Prince Albert, and the rather beautiful Raphaelesque, I think you'll agree, Madonna and Child is now in the royal collection. So Albert was very keen to promote this new Germanic style of painting, but you could imagine that that was rather played down given the sort of currents afoot in the mid-19th century. So many of the Pre-Raphaelites have leanings towards Roman Catholicism, or what was referred to at the time as Anglo-Catholicism, i.e. high church, but remaining within the Anglican church faith. A good example of that is John Herbert, who converts to Roman Catholicism in 1840, and who, like the Nazarenes, wants to paint religious subjects. Remember, this is problematic, ironically, because of the passing of the Emancipation Act earlier in the 19th century. Herbert is going to have a huge influence on the Pre-Raphaelites. They actually want him to sponsor their magazine, which was called The Germ, as in germination, putting forward new ideas. And when we come to see Christ in the Carpenter's Shop by John Everett Millais, you're going to realise immediately that it's based on this painting by Herbert. Another conduit between the Nazarenes and the Pre-Raphaelites is Ford Madox Brown, who you might have imagined, as he was very much Rossetti's mentor, might have been one of the original brothers. but he was deemed to be too old to join the brothers, and also he was seen to be too well established. But I'm showing you here another precursor to the Pre-Raphaelites. This is Ford Madox Brown's John Wycliffe reading his translation of the Bible to John of Gaunt, who we see on the far right-hand side. And this is what I mean by realism, the accuracy of the costumes. Ford Madox Brown had numerous books on antique costumes. He was particularly keen on getting the footwear correct, you'll be pleased to know. So when we talk about Pre-Raphaelite realism, it might be better to think about it as authenticity, painting an imaginary subject, whether it be from the Bible, history, or literature, as authentically as possible. Verisimilitude might have been the word that the Victorians used. Also note the importance of the frame. On the one side we have a pilgrim, perhaps going to Santiago de Compostela. On the other you have what appears to be an angel holding a copy of the Bible. So as I said, it's surprising in a way that Ford Madox Brown was not a member of the original Brotherhood. Founded in 1848, it only lasted until 1853, by which time the brothers started to go their own way. But he was just that little bit older, born in 1821. Arthur Hughes might have been an original brother. He's going to be part of the second wave of Pre-Raphaelitism, as he's going to be one of the painters at the Oxford Union. And Charles Alston Collins, well, he very nearly was an original brother, because James Collinson drops out of the original group when he converts to Roman Catholicism. So here are the original brothers. Of course, the big three are John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. His brother William was dragged in. He had no aspirations to being an artist. Frederick Stevens will go on to become an art critic. As I said, Collinson will leave very shortly after the foundation of the Brotherhood, because he converts to Roman Catholicism. And Thomas Woolner is one of the reasons why the Brotherhood breaks up, because he's going to emigrate to Australia in 1853. In that year, Hunt will also go off to Palestine to paint his subjects derived from the Bible. And also John Everett Millais will be on the brink of becoming an associate member of the Royal Academy. And these are all the reasons why the Brotherhood lasts for such a short period, 48 to 53. The big three have very different backgrounds. John Everett Millais is from a privileged background. He was a child protege. He has links to Jersey and to Southampton. His mother married a very wealthy Southampton brewer by the name of Enoch Hodgkinson. This is important in our story, as his two half-brothers, Henry and Clement. Henry will be the one that goes to study in Oxford, which is the reason why Millais makes so many trips to the City of Many Spires. Also, through this marriage to Enoch Hodgkinson, the Millais family are very well off. In fact, it's rather romantic. We are told that Millais' mother married him for love, him being a rather hard-up musician from Jersey. The drawings that you see here, as you can see, are all dated 1853 and were created as gifts to Woolner as he was leaving on his journey to Australia. And I wanted to show you them when they were young, but as you can see, him already by 1853, Rossetti was already, I'm afraid, losing his hair. Rossetti's background is very romantic. He's the son of an emigre Italian scholar, Gabriele Pasquale Giuseppe Rossetti. But perhaps in many ways it's his mother that catches our interest, as she is a Polidori. His uncle, who was, I'm afraid, already dead at the time that Rossetti was born, is John William Polidori, who invented the genre of the vampire. So there's a long literary tradition in the Rossetti family, notwithstanding his sister Christina Rossetti. And then Holman Hunt comes from a very modest background, fails to get into the Royal Academy initially. His father is a warehouse manager. So he is the one, if you'd like to think of it this way, with the largest social chip on his shoulder. The painting that is a catalyst that brings them all together is this one. It's called The Eve of St. Agnes. It's from the story from Keats's poem. Madeleine and Porphyro are stealing away into the night as she's about to be pushed into an arranged marriage, one that was based on status and money. And obviously the Pre-Raphaelites are rather obsessed with the concept of true love. They use each other as models. So I've put a red circle around the head of John Everett Millais, who is said to be the model for the drunken servant in the background. And it was seeing this painting that inspired Rossetti to go and meet Millais and Holman Hunt, as they were at that stage studying in the Royal Academy School. So this is the catalyst for founding the Brotherhood. And the first major painting by John Everett Millais is this one, Isabella. Again, it's a Keats theme. You might know the poem Isabella and the Pot of Basil. And here we start to get our Oxford connections, because Mary Hodgkinson, as you can see it here, who models for Isabella, is Millais' sister-in-law to be. She's affianced to his half-brother Henry, who you will remember is studying in Oxford. They use a lot of their circle as models. It saves money, and also because they are looking for this idea of authenticity. So William Howard Deverell, one of the Pre-Raphaelite artists, is the rather handsome young man on the extreme left-hand side. In front of him, wearing the black hat, is Frederick Stevens, one of the original official PRB. Deverell is very famous in our story, as he is said to be the one who discovers Lizzie Siddal. More of her later. And then tipping his glass up and swallowing the contents at the end, that's always said to be Rossetti. And then Lorenzo is based on William Michael Rossetti, and Mary Hodgkinson, of course, is the model for Isabella. When this painting was shown at the recent exhibition called Pre-Raphaelite Avant-Garde, the press had a bit of a field day with it. They noticed that the wicked brother who's trying to kick the dog, who by the way was based on one of Millais' bullies from his school days, if you look carefully underneath his arm, there is a shadow. And the scurrilous gutter press reckoned that this shadow looked like a giant penis. Again, a sort of foreboding of what is going to come, because of course Isabella and Lorenzo are doomed lovers, and he will be murdered by the wicked brothers, and she will, I'm afraid, go mad for love. But it links rather amusingly to the fact that Millais signed the painting PRB, because even at the time, this was read by some of their adversaries as penis rather better. So I think that's a rather interesting visual link. This idea, again, of painting everybody in their circle comes from looking at Quattrocento painting. Here's one of my favorites, Benozzo Gozzoli's Journey of the Magi to Bethlehem. I've got a close-up of the section on the left-hand side to show you what I mean about real faces, real people, real faces, real clothing, real settings. That's the sort of fundamental element at this stage of Pre-Raphaelitism, echoing Ruskin's famous dictum, to go to nature, selecting nothing, rejecting nothing. So you can see how very close in theme Millais' Christ in the Carpenter's Shop is to that painting by Herbert. Again, this idea of sort of bringing the biblical story to life in this very realistic manner. The important thing was the painting was damned, as you can see, by the critics, particularly Dickens. And this was going to have a huge impact on terms of their selling power. Isabella and Lorenzo had sold for £100, believe it or not, and a new suit to a consortium of Savile Row tailors. But after this damning criticism by Dickens, nobody could expect to sell their paintings. Christ is a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-haired boy in a nightgown, and the Madonna with her dislocated throat would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest cabaret in France, or the lowest gin shop in England. The Virgin, by the way, is said to be either based on Mary Hodgkinson again, that's his sister-in-law, or his own mother. And of course, again, it's that idea of using people within your own circle to make the painting come to life. The important thing from our point of view in our Oxford story was that these high church paintings appealed to a select group of Oxford businessmen. We are in the midst of the mid-Victorian high church movement, which was led by both Oxford and Cambridge. In Oxford, we have Cardinal Newman, Keble and Pusey. They are sometimes known as Tractarians because they had their sort of tracts which were published and were read by the general populace, but they are advocating a return to many of the trappings that we associate with the Roman Catholic faith. And James Wyatt, who had high church leanings, was one of the first supporters of the fledgling Pre-Raphaelites, supporting them at a time when they really needed it due to all this adverse criticism. So this is James Wyatt and his granddaughter Mary, 1849. There are two versions of it. The original is owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. And Wyatt made his money essentially as a picture dealer and originally as a frame maker. Before we leave his rather grumpy image, I just love all the trappings that he has around him. His conservatory, and I love his china cabinet in the background. So Wyatt was originally a carver and a gilder. He originally sets himself up in that trade. He moves to dealing pictures and prints. By 1823, he's primarily a print seller, and he commissions Turner to paint this very famous image of the High Street, to have it engraved to sell in 1810. Prints, of course, are the sort of like way in which the Victorian society sort of opens up new visual imagery, these new improved printing technologies. After Wyatt's death, Millais describes him as the most upright, fine old gentleman. So clearly there was a rapport between the older and the younger man. One of Millais' paintings that I have to confess always makes me smile a little is Combe and Iphigenia. It's now in the Lady Lever Art Gallery. It's a pre-Raphaelite painting, as you can see, 1847 to 49, bought by Wyatt. So, I mean, Millais at this stage is very young, as you can see, only 17 years old. Gives you an idea of his precocious talent. The wonder child, if I can put it that way. This is so Victorian. I mean, you can see here what I mean about the academic style. The nymphets reminds me very much of the paintings by people like Etty. Very idealized, and not very convincing at all. I particularly love Kaimon, who is this barbaric character wearing his animal skin in the center, attempting to woo the beautiful Iphigenia. It's fantastic painting, but perhaps not for all the right reasons. Very different is this painting of James Wyatt's daughter-in-law and her daughter Sarah, which has been done in a deliberately archaic style. Again, they are deliberately aping the primitives, and it has a primitive flat quality to it. But again, there's still a sort of more of a lingering essence of Raphaelitism, because if you look on the wall behind, we have two images by Raphael of the Madonna and Leonardo's Last Supper in the center. So it's rather, again, a sort of fascinating sort of way in which the Pre-Raphaelites look back to go forward. We know that Millais was going backwards and forwards to Oxford a lot in 1850, during the year that this was painted, because he was working on two very important works, Mariana and The Woodman's Daughter. So here is The Woodman's Daughter. This also emphasizes their love of basing their paintings on literary themes. This is Coventry Patmore's poem of star-crossed lovers. She's working class, he's an aristocratic lad. It's going to end, I'm afraid, in disaster. As you can see, I've given you some lines, some verses from the poem. She went merely to think she'd helped, helping her, we assume, father in the background. And whilst he hacked and saw the rich squire's son, a young boy, then whole mornings, as if awed, stood silent by and gazed in turn at Gerald and on Maud. They're going to fall in love, obviously, but I'm afraid that when they grow up, they will have an affair. She will be abandoned by the rich squire's son, and at the end of the poem, she will take her own life and that of her newly born baby. Good bit of Victorian melodrama. In terms of our Oxford story, the background is Witham Woods, which is near Botley. The legend goes that Millais was working on this background, painting it directly from nature out of doors, literally en plein air, like a French impressionist will do some 20 years later. The difference is that the French technique was fast, but the Pre-Raphaelite technique is slow and laborious, using often brushes with only one or two hairs, and they might take several weeks just to paint one portion of a painting, a bush or a flower, again in this striving for authenticity. And it's whilst he's painting in the Botley Woods that we have this story that Thomas Combe comes upon, not only Millais painting, but Charles Alston Collins. And the Combes are going to take the young Pre-Raphaelites under their wing, again as the family that they might have had, as Martha, that's his wife, and Thomas Combe have no family of their own. You see Thomas Combe here in his portrait by Millais, and if you look in the background, there's a coat of arms to whom he has no right to use, by the way, Shakespeare's friend John Combe. But remember, they loved Shakespeare, and all of my arrivistes nouveau riche longed to have a pedigree, so he has borrowed the coat of arms of John Combe. Essentially, Thomas Combe's money comes from printing. He will be put in charge of the Oxford Clarendon Press. This is the largest publisher of Bibles in the world, and as you probably guessed, like Wyatt, Thomas Combe is high church. We see him here in his relative youth, painted in 1850, and then 1863 is the date of the bust by him by Woolner, where he really does look the part, doesn't he, of a Victorian patriarch. I particularly like the fact that Combe is painted not with his faithful dog, but with his faithful tabby cat. I would love to have been a fly on the wall at these family get-togethers. So here is Martha. She was very talented in her own right, very well educated. She had received some education in the arts. She had been tutored by the famous Birmingham painter David Cox. So here you see them gathered together. We have Martha in the centre. We have Thomas Combe probably reading to the group from a Bible. It's got two candles to illuminate him on the right-hand side. Charles Alston Collins is in shadow, far right. On the floor, we have a young leggy, John Everett Millais, and the gentleman in the chair is Martha's uncle, who is quite an important figure in our story, as you'll see in a minute. But most importantly, they are enjoying this sort of family ambience here between September and November of 1850. These are two later portrayals of Thomas and Martha Combe by Holman Hunt. The dates are in fact a little spurious because they were finished, as you can see, and given as gifts as late as 1895. One's dated 1880, one was originally started in 1861. And I love the one of Thomas Combe with that rather wry smile and that huge beard. And I think Martha looks quite forbidding, doesn't she? But remember that she was acting as a bit of a mother figure to the young Charles Alston Collins and Millais. Now, I mentioned Martha's uncle, a chap by the name of Bennett, and he will actually buy the painting in the middle for just over 150 guineas as a gift for Thomas Combe, which is the catalyst for his collection. Because having received this painting as a gift, Thomas Combe will add to it to create a Victorian triptych of faith, hope and charity. The Return of the Dove to the Ark on the left-hand side by Millais, and on the right Alston Collins' Convent Thoughts. In the centre, Hunt's Converted British Family, which tells the story, as you probably gathered, of a Christian missionary who finds himself in a dire situation. Our early Christian family are looking out through the door to see another missionary pursued by what appeared to be Druids. There's something like Stonehenge or Avebury in the far background. Historically, this is not very accurate, but it's putting over this image of the first Christians in Britain. In the centre, we have a Pietà theme, the mother supporting the Christian missionary, the girl cleaning the missionary's feet in the way of Christ's feet being cleansed at the Last Supper. So lots of religious references throughout the entire painting. Symbolic realism, remember, is how Hunt referred to it. But most importantly, note the girl in the middle who's about to sponge our missionary, holding the bowl. That's Lizzie Siddal, who is such an important figure in these opening years of Pre-Raphaelitism, because, of course, she will become Rossetti's preferred model. She's an artist in her own right. And very briefly, she will become Mrs. Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And sadly, she dies in 1862, the consequence really of a deep depression after the birth of her stillborn child. Guggins is how she was known to Rossetti. And Charles Alston Collins, well, that name might be familiar to you if you are familiar with his brother Wilkie Collins, as in The Woman in White. So there's like a network of family and friends that binds the Pre-Raphaelites together. Convent Thoughts was actually painted in Thomas Coomb's garden. The model was their housemaid, Frances Ludlow. In fact, Millais himself rather coveted using her, but she only ever modelled for this one painting of a nun. Collins was paid £150 for it, which at the time was a reasonable sum of money. And I particularly, again, like all the symbolic realism, all of the lilies are there, again, to represent purity. She's in a sort of hortus conclusus, or sacred garden. Even her goldfish are colour-coded. The ones immediately in front of her are white. The fantastic frame was designed by Millais, again with lilies. And she's holding in her hand and holding two separate pages, a beginning and end, an alpha and omega, an annunciation on one side and a crucifixion on the other. You'll notice that the surplice that she's wearing is far too big for her. Again, this is because they frequently shared costumes as well amongst the group. So I'm glad that it hasn't fallen down over her prayer book. Always was amused by this idea that it was painted in Thomas Coomb's garden. I'd got an image of a big Victorian suburban villa in Oxford, quite grand, probably red brick, but no, this is Thomas Coomb's home. This is the Oxford University Press building, which you may not have spotted on trips to Oxford, as it's in a suburb by the name of Jericho. It was built by Robinson and Blore, Blore being a very well-known Victorian architect, in 1830. This is the main entrance, which leads to a quad. Coomb's house was in the quad. The one that he had was called North House. There's North House and South House, and they were the residences for the managers of the Oxford Clarendon Press. So this, within the quadrangle, I'm showing you the quadrangle photographed in 1905, but on the left-hand side is actually North House. So when we say Thomas Coomb's garden, this is not really a suburban idyll, but a very grand garden indeed. So photographed here in 1905. From his obit, well, he dies, this is Thomas Combe in the 1870s. His last great public act was to commission St Barnabas Church, which was it's a very working class part of Oxford, this area known as Jericho. The architect was Blomfeld, and here it is today, in, interestingly, an Italian Renaissance style. It's very like something that you might encounter in Florence, like the famous Duomo. And so I thought it was interesting that the style was Italian Renaissance and not Gothic. Back to our Pre-Raphaelite story. So the return of the dove to the ark again rises the hackles of Charles Dickens, who writes in the time this terrible diatribe. Their faith seems to consist in absolute contempt for perspective and the known laws of light and shade, an aversion to beauty in every shape. Even the girls, by the way, were criticised for being ordinary every day. They weren't pretty enough. They weren't sugary, and with ringlets. They were just ordinary working class girls. A singular devotion to the minute accidents in their subject, a reference to the hay that they're standing on, including out, or rather seeking out, every excess of sharpness and deformity. The girls have got no background, which makes them stand out even more, although we are told that originally Millais had planned a much more elaborate background, but he ran out of time, so he wanted it ready for the Royal Academy summer show. The other thing to really notice is the colour coordination of the girls. They were already wearing the colours of the suffragists and suffragettes, green, white and violet, for Give Women the Vote. And Pre-Raphaelite women are always they're always essentially linked to the emergence of the new woman, a woman that was herself challenging Victorian norms. Fortunately, in our story, Ruskin comes riding in on his charger to save the Pre-Raphaelites in May 1851. Because at this point, it looked like they might be damned before they'd even started. Remember, they've got to sell their paintings. This is a very commercial market. Along comes Ruskin and basically says that the Pre-Raphaelites are living up to his own ideas of going to nature, selecting nothing, rejecting nothing. It also looks like nature has been put under a microscope. Please notice the rocks that he is standing on, the famous falls at Glenfinlas. It was during the painting of this portrait that, of course, Millais fell in love with his wife, Euphemia Gray. But that's a story for another day. At this stage, and by the way, the painting is in the Ashmolean now of Ruskin, what I really want you to notice is this idea of focusing on nature and putting it under a microscope. And everything seems to have a clarity to it. Very bright colours, none of the dark colours that you associate with the old masters. Like a Jan van Eyck, the background appears to be as intensely painted as the foreground, as in a Jan van Eyck painting. So there's a luminosity and an attention to detail that is almost fanatical, seen here in John William Inchbald's Study in March in the Ashmolean, which was to be read alongside Wordsworth's The Excursion. When the primrose flower peeped forth to give an earnest of the spring. And down the bottom, I'm showing you one of Ruskin's own studies of rocks and ferns. Again, to emphasize this idea of looking at a little tiny part of nature in intense detail, like rocks and ferns, as you see here. It always reminds me of Blake's famous adage, to see the world in a grain of sand. And to give you some idea of Ruskin's own talent, this wonderful kingfisher is in the Ashmolean collection. It's very rarely out. It's a watercolour. It has to be protected from sunlight. But I think you'll agree it's a stunning example of this idea of sort of trying to capture nature as realistically as possible. You can almost see every feather on the bird's wings. So not surprisingly, Ruskin now comes to the rescue of the Pre-Raphaelites. However, in 1854, we can already look ahead to what is going to happen in terms of the emergence of the second generation of Pre-Raphaelites, led by Rossetti, but bringing Morris and Burne-Jones into our story. Morris and Burne-Jones see the Thomas Combe collection in 1854, when it's put on display in the Old Town Hall in Oxford. Fortunately, we have a watercolour of this exhibition showing the works which were displayed. And I've got a close-up, not very good, of the important works from the Combe collection. Millais' Return of the Dove to the Ark, Colin's Convent Thoughts, Millais' James Wyatt, Millais James Wyatt and his granddaughter, the one owned by Lloyd Webber, and finally Holman Hunt's New College Cloisters. And there's a close-up of some of these on the right-hand side. This has an immediate impact on Morris and Burne-Jones, and in particular Burne-Jones immediately takes himself off to London to that summer's Royal Academy show to see, of course, the paintings by Holman Hunt, the infamous Awakening Conscience, which is about a kept woman waking up to realise the error of her ways. And what she is seeing, because this was designed as a diptych, so 2 panels, not 3, but was designed to indicate that she was seeing the light of the world. So it gives you a completely different perspective of these 2 works when you know that she's actually reacting to Hunt's most famous religious painting of all, The Light of the World. This is also, there are 2 versions of it, but the version bought by Thomas Combe is now in Keble College. After he died, Martha, his widow, bequeathed The Light of the World to Keble College. Butterfield did not approve of this. That was the architect of Keble. So he created a side chapel, especially for The Light of the World. We could spend the rest of our hour dissecting the Awakening Conscience and The Light of the World. But the important thing is it's essentially an image of learning the error of our ways and the light of the world reminding us of the importance of faith. And even if you're like our fallen woman, hidden behind this door covered in weeds, the message of Christ and redemption will win through in the end. The lamp, by the way, that he is holding survives and is in the collection in Manchester. You'll also find in the Ashmolean a version of the Afterglow in Egypt. The original is in the collection in Southampton, which was the one that Hunt worked on in Egypt. So with the money that he has made from selling the Awakening Conscience and The Light of the World, by the way, the model for the Awakening Conscience is Annie Miller. But with the money from that, he's able to go to Egypt and Palestine to paint the religious themes that attract him as authentically as possible. There are big differences between the original one in Southampton. Here you can see she's got a sheaf of wheat on her head. Perhaps there's less clutter, just pigeons at her feet. But in the smaller version, in the Ashmolean, we've got the addition of a calf. You can see the mother cow immediately behind being led across the water. Both are holding up vessels, which is to represent the idea of virginity, Virgo intacto, and she's got the pigeons on her head. The idea here is this is a marriageable woman, so we can sort of see that idea of her beauty. But if we read the title Afterglow in Egypt, it has a subtle undercurrent. It's to remind you that Egypt was once a great civilization, but much of that has now gone. All empires fall. And so this is all that's left, Hunt is telling us, of that great past Egyptian civilization, hence Afterglow in Egypt. Hunt's paintings are not without good reason often referred to as sermons in paint. So Hunt has gone off to paint in the Holy Land. Millais is about to pass over into the Royal Academy, and some might even say sells out. But remember, his situation changes quite dramatically. He falls in love with Ruskin's wife. We believe that it was whilst painting the Order of Release, how aptly named, that he falls in love with Effie, Euphemia Gray. After a difficult period, she will get divorced, or I should say her marriage to Ruskin will be annulled, and she will eventually marry, of course, Millais, and have a very happy and productive life. She was the model for the Order of Release, and some people say that this had deliberate intent on Ruskin's part, and it was almost inevitable that the two much younger people would fall in love. Ironically, the Black Brunswick of 1860, now in the Lady Lever Art Gallery, will bring Millais back into the limelight after a period of having a shadow cast over him due to the Ruskin affair. But I particularly wanted to put it in because the model for the beautiful girl here is Kate Dickens, Charles Dickens' daughter, which shows you how quickly Millais was assimilated into the establishment. But when it comes to telling the second part of our story about Oxford and the Pre-Raphaelites, we shift very much to Rossetti. So here is his beautiful watercolour. It was bought by Thomas Combe from the Francis McCracken sale in 1855. Dante drawing an angel on the first anniversary of the death of Beatrice, which immediately reminds you that his obsessions are not social realism, the awakening conscience, or authentic religious works of art, the light of the world, but the romance of Dante and the romance of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. This is still probably modelled for the girl on the left-hand side. Please note the colours that she is wearing, purple, green and white yet again. And this, of course, brings us to, of course, Burne-Jones and William Morris. So remember that Burne-Jones runs off to the Royal Academy to see these paintings by Hunt. He doesn't want to enter the Royal Academy schools, so he goes off to be tutored by Rossetti. This was not what his father intended at all. He had gone to Exeter College, 1852 to 53 is when he arrives, with the intention of taking a divinity degree, i.e. going into the church. Morris's mother had similar ambitions. So we see Morris and Burne-Jones down the bottom, who are both attending Exeter College. The Oxford set was also made up of students who were across the road at Pembroke. So Charles or Charlie Faulkner and Cornell or Corn Price, as he is referred to. They're often simply named the Birmingham Gang, because of course that is where Burne-Jones comes from. But I wanted to show you Charlie Faulkner because of course he is in the name, Morris Marshall Faulkner and Co. So he's one of the original Oxford brothers. Whilst at Oxford, Morris does a lot more than discover the Pre-Raphaelites. His encounters include discovering Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, the 1817 edition by Sauvé, which will be a core text for him and Burne-Jones. And also he will discover Ruskin's Stones of Venice, last section published in 1853. You're seeing a version of it here published by the Kelmscott Press, emphasising that Morris will use this almost as a manifesto for his own ideas, that anything made by hand will be superior to anything made by a machine. Irregularity was very important. It was the hand of the man who made it. So remembering that Burne-Jones has gone off to London in search of Rossetti and wants to become now a painter, Morris initially decides he wants to be an architect. Articles himself to George Edmund Street, who is still in Oxford at this time. But he's about to get a plum job at the building of the law courts on the Strand, and he is about to move to London. This change in terms of their ambitions, their fate is sealed on a famous walking tour of France in July 1855. Morris visits Amiens Cathedral that you see here, and you can see here again this sort of shift. In a way, the new religion for them is going to be art itself. So Morris wants to become an architect. He wants to build things like Amiens Cathedral. Whilst he's with Street, briefly, he meets his great friend, Philip Webb. So there's, again, all these wonderful interconnections. Our friends are soon reunited in London, and we see here Topsy and Ned in their studio, which was in Red Lion Square. One of the Pre-Raphaelites, it could be Morris or Burne-Jones, is sitting astride the chair, which we see in the corner, the Arming of the Night. The painted section was designed by William Morris, but he was aided by Rossetti, and the chair itself was designed by Philip Webb. It's all coming together. What I really want you to notice is all of the stuff in the studio, all the detritus There's a candlestick. There appears to be a lizard, immediate foreground, but particularly want you to note the suit of armour in the background, because of course Morris has got to paint everything from life, so he's got to have a suit of armour to paint. So here are parts of it, the sword that he had made and the helm. You have a famous story about him getting his head stuck in the helmet, rather like a cat getting their head stuck in a tin can. And of course he needs this because he wants to paint Arthurian subjects, and they've got to be as authentic as possible. You can see in the background, in fact, one of the most important sections of the Union murals, the Oxford Union murals. In fact, they really are frescoes because they're painted directly on the walls. And you can see here the funny shaped windows that pierce the what was going to be a debating chamber and a library, designed by Benjamin Woodward and finished in the mid-1850s. Those windows are going to create havoc in terms of the lighting of the frescoes. So here is the overall scheme. And it was never completed. Rossetti got bored with the whole concept and much of it was left undone. The process, they didn't understand fresco painting, so the walls weren't properly prepared, and of course lime leaches through. Over the years, what was painted was damaged by smoke and gas lamps, but nevertheless, because it is so fundamental in the story of the Pre-Raphaelites, we all want to go and see the Oxford Union murals. They are really a wreck, as you can see, and but nevertheless very important. The ceiling itself is painted by Morris. He finishes his panel ahead of all of his brothers, and he starts to doodle on the ceiling to show his true métier, which is pattern making. But the ceiling that you see here was repainted by him at a later date. I'm only going to show you a couple of them because they are, as I said, very difficult to photograph. But the important thing is that they are all from the story of the Morte d'Arthur. This is a debating chamber. Remember that the centre of this is the impact of the illicit love between Lancelot and Guinevere. Undoubtedly, the most important panel is the one painted by Rossetti that features Guinevere in the centre of the image, as you can see here in my cartoon by Max Beerbohm. And it's because of his adultery with Guinevere that Lancelot will never receive the Sac Grail. This famous cartoon is much later in date, 1916, but I particularly like it because it has Benjamin Jowett, who was a very down-to-earth philosopher, asking Rossetti, and what are they going to do with the Grail when they found it, Mr. Rossetti? Again, looking ahead to what happens in terms of their own autobiography, the panel painted by Morris is of Sir Palomides' jealousy of Sir Tristram and Iseult. And of course, this is sort of like looking ahead to the complicated relationship between Rossetti, Jane Morris, who's about to be discovered in Oxford during this fateful summer of 1857, and Rossetti. So a sort of three-way love affair. So here is this famous panel. So there is Guinevere in the centre, a slumbering Lancelot on the left-hand side, and the angel basically is there to say he will never receive the Sac Grail. The group of seven who make up the seven members of this second brotherhood: Rossetti, Burne-Jones, Valentine Prinsep, John Hungerford Pollen, Rodham Spencer Stanhope, who is the uncle of Evelyn de Morgan, and Arthur Hughes. They make up the second Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, really for just this one summer. And here is the drawing. You can perhaps see it now better, of Guinevere in the centre. But most importantly, her features are transformed from the original sketch, which shows Lizzie Siddal. Her features take on those of Jane, who you see on the left-hand side. Jane, we often say, or people often say, did Rossetti make her up? from this famous photograph of her taken in 1865, you can see that she does indeed have this mass of dark, crinkly hair, those big soulful eyes, and those bee-stung lips. One of a sequence of photographs taken by Rossetti himself in his garden at Cheyne Walk in 1865 was the basis for this beautiful chalk drawing entitled Reverie. Several of the, well, in fact, the three major works which were bequeathed to Jane Morris in Rossetti's will end up at the Ashmolean. So this wonderful chalk drawing of Jane Reverie, a day again, so daydreaming, will be found in the Ashmolean. It's not always out because these are quite fragile works of art. So daydream is also watercolor and graphite. It's the oil version is in the V&A, and again it's the theme of the daydream. So these were works that Rossetti never parted with. My personal favorite is Pearl Oscura. Jane, with sort of like bringing over the fact that she was a dark pearl, her coloring was often said to be rather Romany-like. And again, she was not a classic Victorian beauty. You know, as you can see here with her heavy jaw, her very distinctive features, she broke the mold in terms of Victorian beauty. Famously, she is painted by Morris. This is his only oil painting. It is started in Oxford using Jane as the model. He writes on the back of it, "I love you, but I cannot paint you." It will lead to their betrothal. She's bound to choose Morris over Rossetti. He's a much better financial bet, if I can put it that way, than the impecunious Rossetti. Nevertheless, cast as either Guinevere or La Belle Isolte, you can see it is full of almost autobiographical, portentous signs. The fact that Jane is putting on a girdle to marry King Mark when she's really in love with Sir Tristram. The painting itself has lots of echoes of the Arnolfini marriage, particularly the oranges on the left-hand side. They will be gifted this prioress's cabinet. The painting is by Burne-Jones. The carcass of the wardrobe is by Philip Webb. And I've often thought it's a very hard-hitting subject, the prioress's tale, to have in your bedroom, as it's the story of a boy who is murdered because he sings so well. All of his murderers are being rounded up in the background, and the Virgin is bringing him to life, and he is singing out Ave Redemptoris. I want to emphasize that Burne-Jones keeps coming back to particular themes. I've already mentioned how important the Morte d'Arthur is. The other is Chaucer. He will take lots of themes for his paintings from Chaucer, from the Romance of the Rose, which is again a sort of Chaucerian tale. And he'll keep coming back to these themes. They haunt him for most of his life. So this is a very late version of the Prioress's Tale, not completed until 1898. But you can see here how the sort of composition is echoing the original design on the wardrobe. I love the sunflowers. And then the page from the Prioress's Tale in the Kelmscott Chaucer shows you how the composition has been altered to fit the different medium. So against that nice idea of a continuous return to a favourite theme. We're going to end with the stained glass windows in Christ Church Cathedral. St Mary's is its actual dedication. We're going to start with this very famous window, originally designed in 1870 to 71, which is Faith, Hope and Charity. Caryatid in the centre. And it's often said that Fides is based on Jane's profile. The angels above are by Morris. Now, the windows, of course, were made by Morris & Co. It's a complicated arrangement between Burne-Jones and Morris. Burne-Jones designed the cartoons, but did not choose the colours. That was very much down to William Morris. After 18 81. They are made at Merton Abbey. So it's very much a partnership in terms of the making of the windows. The cartoons are used over and over again, and faith, hope and charity are particularly popular. Hope herself is based on a section or a part of the imagery of the Scavengi Chapel in Padua, i.e. Giotto. So you can see here, spes, faith. And we've got the Christchurch version. We've got the version from the Lady Chapel, All Saints League. She's in blue. And here at the end, we've got the painted version of 1896. Again, showing you the very complicated interrelationships between Burne-Jones's designs for stained glass and his finished paintings. In fact, you can trace the whole of Burne-Jones's evolution as a stained glass designer through the windows at Christchurch. The St. Fried's wide window is commemorating the patron saint of Oxford. It's a densely packed window, as you can see. Doesn't really work from a distance. You'll learn a lot from this window. It also, again, is packed with symbolism. And I'm showing you a close-up of one of the elaborate quatrefoils above the lancets, because, of course, it's one of my favourite themes. It's Lilith, who her head on the snake's body, who tempts Eve in the garden. And you can see here Michelangelo's version down the bottom with a very muscular Lilith and a snaky body coming out of the tree. I'm very fond of this window, however. You can perhaps understand it better in the cartoon, which is, by the way, in Aberdeen. St. Fried's wide patron saint of Oxford doesn't want to marry King Agar of Leicester. She wants to found her own monastic institution. She goes through lots of trials and tribulations in her attempt to escape marriage. She's crossing the river at the top through sunflowers and will take refuge in a pigsty. King Agar on horseback down the bottom is clearly based on another influential Pre-Raphaelite hero, Albrecht Dürer. Here his Night, Death and the Devil. Dürer was a huge influence on both Morris and Burne-Jones, and you can see that King Agar is based on this very famous work by Dürer, which dates to 1513. I particularly love the ending of the story of St. Fried's wife because she's an Anglo-Saxon saint, remember, but on her deathbed you can see in the background a flushing toilet, courtesy of Thomas Crapper. This has just been invented. So I love, again, Burne-Jones's sense of humour, that St. Fried's wife dies with all mod cons in the background. You can just see it hiding behind the curtain. I love it. Next to it is the Viner window. You can see how much he's learnt just from comparing the St. Fried's wide and the Viner window. Large figure, narrative panel underneath. This is a very famous window because it commemorates the death of one of Christchurch's students. Young Viner had been abducted and killed by Greek brigands, and the window was paid for with the ransom money, the blood money, which was never paid. So the family used that money to build 2 churches in Yorkshire and for this wonderful William Morris window. It's all about motherhood and bringing up the next generation, remembering that it's commemorating a young boy killed on the eve of his maturity. So I particularly like David and Goliath, and of course Timothy and his mother at the end. She's teaching him to read. That's the cartoon for David and Goliath. It's in the Christchurch collection. This is a close-up of Timothy being taught to read by his mother. And right over his shoulder, you'll see it has the initials EBJ for Burne-Jones, the designer, and Charles Fairfax Murray for the painter. And this is the only window I've ever come across with Burne-Jones's initials on, probably because of the poignancy of the story of the death of young Viner. Next to it is the beautiful St. Cecilia window, again dates to the mid-1870s. Once the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings is founded, I should say, Morris is very reticent to put new windows into old churches. Nevertheless, I think you'll agree the St. Cecilia window is particularly magnificent. And you're seeing the cartoon worked up to a finished work of art. So often Burne-Jones would get the cartoons back and he could then transform them into works of art that could be shown and obviously sold. Down the bottom we have panels relating to the life of St. Cecilia. But first of all, the beautiful angels. So here is the other cartoon worked up into a finished work of art. And here is St. Cecilia herself in a magnificent, as you can see, gilded frame. And these are not oil. They are a combination of chalk and gouache, a type of watercolor. I want you to notice the panels underneath. They also get used many times. The first panel is showing St. Cecilia reading to her husband Valerian, who she is going to convert. You can see here he is wearing yellow and she is wearing blue. But in this version, there are several versions of St. Cecilia. He's wearing blue and she's got a sort of pattern. And as you can see here at the end, so the first one is Valerian being read to by St. Cecilia, and the last one is, I'm afraid, her execution. And I was showing you this because Scott and I worked very hard on these panels, which are in a house somewhere in the Cotswolds. They originally had a large central figure of St. Cecilia as part of the design. I think this is now in Princeton. And we tried to reconstruct it. It originally all lived at Bowden Hall. And this is what you can read in the British Art Journal. Scott and I endeavouring to study or put this window, study the origins, the history of the window, and attempted to put it together as it's now been split up. And as I said, St. Cecilia herself is in Princeton. So my last of the Oxford windows in Christchurch is the St. Catherine window, equally famous because the model for this is Edith Liddell, who had just died in just before 1878. So it's a memorial window. The cartoon for it shows St. Catherine being greeted into heaven. So it's the Virgin who is greeting her, and we have Christ in the background surrounded by angels. So these are the narrative panels underneath. But again, I love the big angels to either side standing on their rather gruesome spiked wheels. I'm going to very quickly end with my favourite windows in Oxford. They are in Harris, Manchester. This is a little lesser known college. It is the Unitarian College. Harris, because he's one of the benefactors, and also because it was designed for Unitarians, primarily coming from Manchester, Unitarian heartland, as is Birmingham and Liverpool. The Days of Creation are undoubtedly, I think, my favourite windows, so I couldn't resist ending with these. They're actually based on much earlier windows made for a church, All Saints Middleton Cheney, which is near Banbury. The west window is this one, and it shows these, again, amazing figures of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are being literally consumed in the fire, the blazing fiery furnace. But above them, you can see the origins of the days of creation. So there are 6 days of creation altogether, because, of course, God rested on the 7th day. So I'm showing the two at the bottom are the first in the sequence. So night and day, air and water. So here are the two better views. I particularly like the one on the left-hand side, which of course is the trees to represent. Again, these are all from Genesis. So it's the 6 days of creation, and night and day is on the right-hand side. Burne-Jones would then work those up into this magnificent series of oil paintings. Originally an entire group. I'm afraid they were split up, and the central panel, where she's wearing a rather strange purple colour, is the one that is missing. If you could find it for us, please. These were shown at the Grosvenor Gallery in 1877. So it's quite interesting that the stained glass comes first, then they're worked up into these magnificent oil panels. Here they are in close-up again. Each day gets a new angel, if I can put it that way. So the third day has 3, and obviously the fifth day has 5, and she's holding the birds of the air. I just think they're glorious. And then these are transformed again into the stained glass panels of the 1890s at Harris, Manchester. So again, each one holding a globe or a ball representing the day itself, and then joined by an angel as you work through the sequence. Here they are. So that's, again, the trees. I particularly like that one. So you can see here the birds of the air. These are the last two. So birds of the air and Adam and Eve right at the very end. So to come to the end of my Morris and Burne-Jones story in Oxford, I really felt that I could not end without showing you the tapestry at Exeter College. So this was commissioned by John Prideaux Lightfoot, which 1886, it was to be a gift to their alma mater, Exeter College. It's still there in the chapel. The theme chosen was the Adoration of the Magi, and showing you the original cartoons for it as mapped out by Burne-Jones. But you will know that it was turned into one of the, well, was usually said to be the largest watercolour of the Victorian era. But I'm going to leave you with my favourite cartoon of Rossetti. You either love them or you hate them in terms of their art. But one of the reasons why I think they have proved so long-lasting in terms of public appreciation is that we love them as much as we love their paintings. So I leave you with Rossetti mourning the death of one of his wombats on the 6th of November 1869 as a good example of the way in which we love the Pre-Raphaelites themselves and their stories as much as their paintings.